That night on the Tonight Show stage, Steve Martin stopped mid-laugh, turned his head toward the audience, and went absolutely still. He had been in the middle of a story, the kind he tells better than almost anyone alive, the kind that builds and pivots and arrives somewhere the listener never saw coming. And then something in the fifth row caught his eye, and the story simply stopped. Not paused, stopped, the way a clock stops. The way a room stops when something enters it that changes the atmospheric pressure of everything inside. His mouth stayed slightly open around the word he had not finished. His eyes found a single point in the audience and did not move from it. Jimmy Fallon watched the moment travel across Steve Martin's face, the way weather travels. First in the eyes, then through the jaw, then into a stillness so complete it seemed to reorganize the air in the studio around it. Jimmy leaned forward. The band had already felt it and gone quiet. Steve Martin did not speak. He did not look away. His right hand moved slowly from the armrest of the couch and came to rest flat against his chest. And he sat that way, one hand pressed against his sternum, looking at a face in the fifth row that he had believed for 38 years he would never see again. And Jimmy Fallon tried to speak, and found that he could not, and 300 people in that studio held their breath as Steve Martin's eyes filled with something that was not quite sadness and not quite joy, but the specific unnamed emotion that lives exactly between them, in the place where time collapses and a person is suddenly, without warning, 27 years old again. It was a Friday night taping. January 2025. The Tonight Show starring Jimmy Fallon. Steve Martin was the guest, ostensibly there to discuss a new project. A living legend at 79, arriving with the particular ease of a man who has long since made peace with every version of himself. The audience had welcomed him the way audiences welcome people who are woven into the fabric of their lives, not as a celebrity but as a constant. Something that has always been there, like a song you grew up hearing that you cannot remember learning. The interview had been everything Steve Martin interviews always are. Brilliant and dry, and occasionally so funny that the room needed a moment to recover before it could applaud. Jimmy was loose and delighted. The energy was warm and crackling. And then Steve Martin's eyes moved across the audience, the casual sweep of a performer instinctively reading his room, and landed on a face in the fifth row, and stayed there. Not a famous face, not a face the cameras would recognize, or the audience would turn to see with understanding. Just a face, an old man, perhaps 80, sitting very upright in his seat, with his hands folded in his lap and his eyes fixed on the stage with an expression that contained something enormous and entirely private. The expression of a person who has waited a very long time for a moment and is now inside it, and is not certain they are equal to it. Steve Martin looked at him the way you look at something you have carried in your memory for so long that seeing it in the world feels like a hallucination. His hand went to his chest. He said nothing. He simply looked, and the studio gathered around his silence and held it. Jimmy Fallon said his name once. Barely a sound. Steve Martin turned to him slowly, the way a person turns when they are coming back from somewhere far. His eyes were bright, and his voice, when it finally came, was stripped of everything except what was true. He said, "That's Walter." He said it the way you say the name of someone who was supposed to be gone. To understand what happened next, you need to understand what happened in 1969. Steve Martin wasn't always Steve Martin, legend, comedy genius. The man who made an entire generation understand that a banjo could be the funniest instrument in the world. In 1969, he was 23 years old, and he was nobody. Not on his way to being somebody. Not emerging, just nobody. A young man from Texas, doing stand-up in small clubs in Los Angeles, with the specific ferocious hunger of a person who has decided on the only thing they will ever want to do, and is terrified in equal measure that they are right and that they are wrong. He had been writing jokes since he was a teenager, performing since his early 20s, and accumulating the particular kind of experience that does not feel like progress while you are in the middle of it. He was playing a club in Hollywood called the Ice House, a Tuesday night, maybe 40 people in the room, the kind of crowd that comes to a Tuesday night comedy show because they have nowhere better to be and the drink prices are reasonable. He was 20 minutes into a 30-minute set, and it was not going well. Not catastrophically, just not going well in the specific grinding way that is worse than catastrophe. Because it gives you nothing to push against, no hostility, no resistance, just 40 people tolerating something that was not yet what it needed to be. In the front row, off to the left, a man was laughing. Not politely, not charitably, actually laughing. The kind that starts somewhere below the ribcage and arrives without permission. The kind that a person who has spent years in clubs can distinguish immediately from its imitations because it has a different sound, a different rhythm, a different relationship to the silence that follows it. The man was in his mid-40s, slight, wearing a jacket that had seen better decades, with wire-rimmed glasses and the kind of face that registers as immediately intelligent, not showy intelligence, the quiet kind. The kind that watches more than it declares. He was laughing at the things that were actually funny, and not laughing at the things that were not. Which made him, in that room on that Tuesday night, the single most useful audience member Steve Martin had ever had. His name was Walter Briggs. He had come to the show alone because his wife, he would explain later, found comedy clubs too loud and his kids were grown and gone, and a Tuesday night was a Tuesday night. He worked as a draftsman for a small engineering firm in Pasadena. He had no connection to show business, no industry contacts, no framework for what he was watching except the framework of a man who had been paying close attention to what made him laugh since childhood and had developed, without meaning to, a precise and unsentimental understanding of why funny things were funny. He came back the following Tuesday. And the Tuesday after that. Every week for 4 months, same seat, front row left, same jacket, the same quality of listening that Steve Martin had noticed on the first night and had begun, without quite admitting it to himself, to depend on. After the 4th show, Walter had waited at the bar until the room emptied, and then introduced himself with the direct simplicity of a person who has no social performance to maintain. "Good set tonight," he said. "The new bit about the arrow through the head, that's the one. That's the bit that goes somewhere." Steve Martin looked at him. He had learned by then to be cautious about opinions offered by strangers in clubs. He had also learned to tell the difference between people who talked about comedy and people who understood it. He said, "What makes you say that?" And Walter Briggs sat down on a bar stool and told him, in precise and unsentimental terms, exactly what the bit did structurally, exactly where it broke the contract with the audience and why that break was the source of its power, exactly how it could go further than Steve was currently taking it. He spoke for 10 minutes. When he finished, Steve Martin sat very still for a moment. Then he said, "How do you know any of that?" Walter shrugged. "I don't know that I do," he said. "I just know what makes me laugh and what makes me feel like I'm watching someone figure out what makes me laugh." The second one is more interesting. They began meeting on Wednesday mornings. Not formally. There was no arrangement, no standing appointment. It simply became the thing that happened. Steve Martin would work on new material through the week, and on Wednesday morning he would meet Walter Briggs at a diner on Colorado Boulevard in Pasadena and talk through what was working and what was not. and Walter would listen and respond with the particular honest care of a person who understood that honesty was the only useful form of respect. He never softened a note that didn't land. He never inflated a reaction to be generous. He laughed when something was funny, and he did not laugh when it wasn't, and in between those two responses he offered, consistently and without ego, the clearest analysis of comedic structure that Steve Martin had encountered from anyone who was not trying to be funny themselves. They met like that for 2 years. Wednesday mornings, Colorado Boulevard, coffee going cold while Steve talked and Walter listened. And the material that would eventually become the defining work of one of the most important comedy careers in American history was quietly, incrementally, shaped by a draftsman from Pasadena who had never told anyone he spent his Wednesday mornings this way and saw no reason to. In the spring of 1971, Walter's firm transferred him to a project in Seattle. Temporary, 6 months, possibly extending to a year. He and Steve had breakfast on the last Wednesday before he left. They talked about the material. They talked about a bit Steve was developing that would take 3 more years to find its final form. Walter said, "When they were getting up to leave, you know what you're doing now. You don't need the Wednesdays anymore." Steve said, "That's not true." Walter smiled with the particular smile of a man who knows he is right and is not going to argue about it. He left for Seattle that Friday. The 6 months became a year. The year became 2. Walter's wife had found Seattle livable, then preferable. The firm had work. The Pacific Northwest had suited them in the way that places sometimes suit people who were always going somewhere and didn't know it until they arrived. The connection between them frayed the way connections fray across distance when neither person is wrong, gradually, gently, through the simple arithmetic of geography and time and lives continuing in their separate directions. Steve Martin's career did what careers do when they have been built correctly from the foundation up. It went up and kept going. The Arrow through the head. Saturday Night Live. The Jerk. Wild and Crazy. The name that became its own category. He thought about Walter Briggs on specific occasions across the years, the first Snill appearance, the first film premiere, the morning after the first review that said the word genius without irony, thought about him with the specific gratitude that a person feels for the people who were present before the proof arrived. He had tried to find him twice in the 90s, through an assistant and then through a private researcher. Walter Briggs had moved twice after Seattle. The trail had gone quiet in the mid-90s and stayed quiet. He had stopped trying but not stopped thinking about him. There is a difference. Walter Briggs was 81 years old now. He had retired from drafting in 2004. His wife, Eleanor, had passed in 2019 after 53 years of marriage. He lived in a small house in Edmonds, Washington, 20 minutes north of Seattle, with a vegetable garden he was serious about, and a stack of library books on the nightstand that was never less than 4 volumes high. He had one daughter, Carol, who lived in Brooklyn and called every Sunday and visited twice a year. He still found Tuesday nights, occasionally, slightly charged with a quality he had never fully explained to anyone, a low-grade alertness, as though somewhere in the circuitry of him a Tuesday night still meant something was about to happen. Carol had found the connection. She was a graphic designer with the instinct of a person who solves problems by looking at them from unexpected angles. She had known the story her whole life, her father's Wednesday mornings, the diner on Colorado Boulevard, the 2 years of material that had built something that turned out to matter. She had never known what to do with it. Then, in the summer of 2024, she had written a letter. A real one, handwritten, sent through a production company to an address that was publicly available. She had written it without telling her father. because she understood that Walter Briggs would have told her it was unnecessary, and she had decided that unnecessary was not the relevant standard. The letter had been received. It had been read. And Steve Martin, sitting in a house in New York with a banjo on the wall and a view of the park, had read it standing up, the way you read things when you cannot stay still for the duration of what they are telling you. He had called Jimmy Fallon that same afternoon. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. Behind the scenes, Steve Martin had made a decision that defied every producer's expectation. He wanted Walter in the studio. Seat 5, front row left. Same position, as close as could be arranged, as the seat at the Ice House in 1969, where a man in a second-hand jacket had laughed at the things that were actually funny and quietly changed the shape of what was coming. He had asked Jimmy to keep it simple. No setup, no announcement, no produced moment. He would see him when he saw him, and whatever happened after that would happen without architecture. Carol had told her father only that she had arranged a trip to New York, an early Christmas gift, a few days in the city, a show. She had not mentioned the Tonight Show specifically until they were in the car from the hotel, and even then she had said only, "I think you might know someone there." Walter had looked at her for a long moment. He had not asked a follow-up question. He had turned back to the window and watched the city go by with the expression of a man quietly preparing himself for something he cannot yet confirm. He had confirmed it the moment Steve Martin walked out onto the stage. He had known the walk before he saw the face, the particular economy of movement of a man who has been comfortable in front of audiences for 50 years. He had sat very straight in his chair. He had folded his hands in his lap. He had waited. The producers knew a VIP guest was seated in the 5th row. They had no further briefing. Jimmy Fallon knew everything and had said nothing to anyone because Steve Martin had asked him to let the moment be what it was. And Jimmy Fallon, who understood better than almost anyone in television what an unmanaged moment looked like and what it was worth, had agreed without condition. Now the studio held its silence around the two of them, the man on the couch and the man in the 5th row, and the silence had the quality of something structural, something load-bearing, something that would crack if anyone moved too quickly inside it. Steve Martin stood. He did not ask permission. He walked off his own set, down the steps, into the audience, and he moved through the 5th row the way you move through a space that you have always known how to navigate, and he stopped in front of Walter Briggs, and Walter Briggs looked up at him from his chair with the calm directness of a man who has spent 81 years being honest about what he saw. "You found me," Steve said. His voice was low and slightly rough, the voice of a man who has arrived somewhere he was not sure he would ever arrive. Walter Briggs shook his head once. "My daughter found you," he said. "I just showed up." There was a pause. "That's what you always did," Steve said. "You just showed up." Walter looked at him with the measuring quality of attention that Steve Martin had recognized in the front row of a Tuesday night in 1969 and had never encountered in quite the same configuration in anyone else. Then he said, "You're still doing the thing." Steve said, "What thing?" "The thing where you build to the left when the audience expects you to build to the right." "I noticed it tonight. Still works. But this is the moment no one in the studio and no one watching at home ever saw coming." Walter Briggs reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, a jacket that had not seen better decades, that was in fact immaculate, pressed for this occasion by a man who had understood on some level what the occasion was, and took out a folded piece of paper. Yellowed, soft along the creases, the kind of paper that has been handled regularly over a very long time by careful hands. He held it out, and Steve Martin took it and unfolded it slowly. It was a page from a legal pad, the paper pale yellow and the lines faded, covered on both sides in handwriting that Steve Martin recognized as his own, the cramped left-leaning script of a 23-year-old working fast, afraid of losing the thought. Notes from a Wednesday morning in 1970. A structural breakdown of the arrow bit, in his own words, with Walter's observations written in the margins in a different hand. Precise, economical, the handwriting of a draftsman, the handwriting of a man who understood that a line should go exactly as far as it needed to go, and not one increment further. Steve Martin stood in the fifth row of the Tonight Show studio and looked at his own handwriting from 55 years ago and could not speak. He tried once. His mouth moved, and nothing came. He tried again, and what came out was not words, but the sound that comes before words, the sound a person makes when they are overtaken by something they have been carrying for a long time, without knowing the weight of it. Walter reached up and put one hand on his arm. The gesture of a man who does not perform comfort, but knows how to offer it. He said, simply and without ceremony, it was all there. It was always all there. You just needed someone to sit in the front row and not lie to you about what they were seeing. Steve Martin sat down in the empty seat beside him. Carol had stood and stepped aside without being asked, because she had known this moment was coming since the day she wrote the letter. And the two men sat in the fifth row of a television studio 55 years after a Tuesday night in Hollywood, and Jimmy Fallon stood at the edge of his own stage, with both hands over his mouth and tears moving freely down his face, and no interest in stopping them. The audience had risen, not at once, in the slow, inevitable way of a room that has witnessed something it will never forget and needs to be on its feet for it. Questlove was standing behind his kit, his drumsticks loose in his hands, watching with the expression of a musician who has just understood something about the genealogy of what he does. A cameraman in the far aisle was not looking through his viewfinder. The director in the control room had stopped issuing instructions entirely. The show had left the building, and something else entirely was happening in its place, and everyone present understood that the correct response to that was not to manage it, but to be inside it, fully, for as long as it lasted. Walter Briggs looked at the page of notes in Steve Martin's hands one more time. He said, "The bit about the arrow. I was right about that one." Steve Martin laughed. It was the real thing, the kind that starts below the ribcage and arrives without permission. And the audience, recognizing it from 50 years of Tuesday nights and Saturday nights, and every night they had ever spent in the company of this man's gift, laughed with him. Walter Briggs flew back to Seattle on Sunday morning. Carol sat beside him on the plane, and he slept for most of the flight in the way that people sleep after something large has finally resolved, deeply, without interruption, with his hands folded in his lap. The legal pad page is back in his jacket pocket, where it has lived for 55 years. He did not consider leaving it behind. Steve Martin asked if he could have a copy made, and Walter had said yes, and a copy now sits in a frame in Steve Martin's office in New York, beside a photograph taken on a Friday night in January in a television studio. Two old men sitting side by side in the fifth row, one of them holding a piece of paper, both of them laughing. Walter's vegetable garden has been doing well this spring. He still goes to the library twice a week. He still finds Tuesday nights slightly charged in a way he has never fully explained. His daughter calls on Sundays, and the calls are longer now, because there is more to say. A comedy writer who saw the clip, a young one, 24 years old, doing sets at a small club in Los Angeles on Tuesday nights, sitting with material that was almost what it needed to be, and not quite yet, watched it 3 times in a row, and then sat down at her desk and worked until 4 in the morning. She has not explained why to anyone. She does not think she needs to. Some people see what you are before you have become it. The ones who are honest about what they see, those are the ones you carry forever.